Good afternoon and welcome to the weekly Roundup with William Hellmann. I am your aging host, William, and this Friday I'm turning 31, and I have a short announcement relating to that, as well as some breaking news that I was handed just before the show started. This week's guest, though, is my good friend Joey Macasieb, a good friend of mine from LA who has a bachelor's in political science from Loyola University of New Orleans, and we'll be talking about the appropriations report from the Department of Commerce relating to this past census, as well as the special election in Texas Congressional District 6. But first, again, I want to make a small announcement. As I said, this Friday I turned 31. So I'm going to be taking a 2-week hiatus, so there'll be 2 weeks with no weekly roundup, while I go to travel, visit family members, and I'm hopefully going to get some writing done. And during that time, I also want to line up some guests, the final guests for the series on the Baltimore 2020 Republican candidates. So it's definitely nothing where I'm getting so exhausted I need to stop doing the show or anything. It's just a matter of, needing to take time off to deal with family things and things relating to the fact that I'm getting so goddamn old. Although, luckily I don't look it yet. Looking pretty on point on that camera. But, yes. Anyway, though, I'm going to skip into this week in the news really quick because, as I said, there is some emergency news I want to share before I cover the rest of the news. And I was just handed this. This is just been put in my hand, so I'm going to have to read it off my phone. But according to a CNN interview, the Biden administration is planning on outsourcing spying on Americans to private firms in order to explicitly bypass the Fourth Amendment. According to the interview and a quote from CNN here, the plan being discussed inside the Department of Homeland Security, according to multiple sources, would in effect allow the department to circumvent restrictions the U.S. government has to surveil American citizens. A source familiar with the effort says it's not about encrypting data, but rather using outside entities who can legally access these private groups to gather large amounts of information that could help the Department of Homeland Security identify key narratives as they emerge. Essentially, they're looking to circumvent our constitutional rights and persecute the political opponents of the Biden administration. Again, going on to another quote from this, by partnering with research firms who have more visibility in the space, the Department of Homeland Security could produce information which would likely be beneficial to both it and the FBI, which can't monitor U.S. citizens in this way without first getting a warrant or having the pretext of an ongoing investigation. So the issue is, and we're about to get into, is their justification. They're using the January 6th riots, the act of vandalism at the Capitol, not the multiple cities on fire and burning in 2020. No, the riots that were instigated by left-wing agitators and were primarily a small group of idiotic Trump supporters that followed these people into the Capitol. Again, let me read a quote from this article here before I go and rant about this some more. Much of the planning for the Capitol Hill riot appeared out in the open on social media platforms and on encrypted apps available to everyone with an internet connection. The DHS is trying to get a better sense of narratives that might lead to violence as they emerge across these channels, according to 2 Department of Homeland Security officials. But tracking those narratives, particularly in the wake of January 6, increasingly requires access to private groups on encrypted apps as extremist groups migrate from forward-facing sites like Facebook. At the time narratives are appearing on Facebook, it's usually too late, one Department of Homeland Security told CNN. Domestic violent extremists are really adaptive and innovative, blah, 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 blah. Basically, they sat there for an entire year and ignored cities burning in plain view. They did not examine any footage. They did not make any arrests on anarchists and terrorists. But now they suddenly care when a bunch of vandals come into the damn congressional offices and steal and destroy a couple of things. And these vandals, they want to play them off as right-wing extremists. But let's not forget, at least one of the people arrested had openly admitted to being a BLM activist who infiltrated under the premise of being a Trump supporter. And another one of these, the MAGA shaman, the guy in the buffalo horns, well, they claim he was a Trump supporter, but why was the man spotted at a BLM rally in Utah last year? This is just a flimsy attempt to justify violating the Fourth Amendment and to justify violating the rights of the political opponents of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden. It is political persecution. Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff for Donald Trump, said, "They spied on Donald Trump's presidential campaign and skated by with no consequences, and now they want to spy on you too. This is a chilling, terrible idea that should be roundly rejected." It is. And the condemnation, it's not only coming from Republicans who will be the target of this Gestapo-like behavior. Former CIA officer Brian Dean Wright, who is a Democrat, by the way, called the plan monstrous, saying Joe Biden wants to partner with the private sector to conduct surveillance because the government can't do it without a warrant or ongoing investigation. This is monstrous. It is. It's monstrous, it's disgusting, it's unconstitutional, and it needs to be stopped. And so I am going and putting out a call to action for my viewers, not just for my viewers, for anybody who sees this. Call your congressman. Tell them, put an end to this right now. Fire these officials and make it quite clear that there will be no attempts to circumvent the goddamn Fourth Amendment or any amendment in the Bill of Rights. Of course, it's going to fall on deaf ears if your lawmaker's a Democrat, though. They're already attacking the Second Amendment. They've already attacked the First Amendment, and they have no interest whatsoever in preserving the Constitution as long as they can grab power. Anyway, we're going to move on back to the scheduled programming. It's now been 6 weeks since I started reporting on the Biden border crisis, and this week doesn't seem to be the week it's letting up. In fact, this week the crisis made it to the steps of power in Washington. This past Friday, a group of illegal immigrants and other open border activists held a protest in front of the White House, blocking a presidential motorcade scheduled to take Joe Biden to the airport. Now, of course, we all know how sympathetic the Biden administration is towards illegal immigrants. He campaigned on letting them into the country. So, in his infinite sympathy, he did the one thing he could to relieve these suffering protesters. He had them arrested. Of course, that's not all, folks. On Sunday, it was announced that the Biden administration is going to open a new detainment center for migrant children in the LA suburb of Pomona. With all this, it makes me wonder why the leftists of the Democratic Party aren't calling him Lock 'em Up Biden, other than the fact that we now have confirmation they are the fascist party. What is truly despicable about this, though, is this man spent the last year coaxing these people to the southern border and created a humanitarian crisis for what we can now all see was his own political gain. The real crisis here is one of incompetence and hypocrisy. Anyway, I guess we'll see how this issue is developed 2 weeks from now when I'm back from hiatus. Now, I'm usually against broad limitist tests to determine party loyalty, but I admit this one had me nodding in agreement when I read it. In an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal last Thursday, Senator Ted Cruz announced that he would no longer accept campaign donations from corporate PACs and challenged other Republicans to follow suit. This comes as yet another signal the GOP is bucking off their label as the party of corporations and becoming a more populist party that supports the American worker. To support his position, Ted Cruz pointed out the cozy relationship corporate America has with the left, saying, "For too long, Republicans have allowed the left and their big business allies to attack our values with no response. We've allowed them to ship jobs overseas, attack gun rights, and destroy our energy companies. We've let them smear the Republicans without paying any price." He also added in a jab to these corporations, when the time comes that you need help with a tax break or a regulatory change, I hope the Democrats take your cause, because we may not. Cruz really hammered hard, of course, at the woke corporate reaction to the Georgia election bill, saying, had these watch me woke it up CEOs actually read the bill instead of parroting the radical left's talking points, they'd have discovered that they had no idea what they were talking about. Anyway, I, for one, will be watching the 2022 elections to see what Republicans, if any, take on Ted Cruz's challenge. Although, let's face it, the Democrats are clearly going and gearing up to cheat again, and if not, to persecute anyone who helps contribute to a win. Last Thursday, the U.S. Council of Bishops announced it was drafting a document to clarify the issue of reception of Holy Communion, especially regarding public figures who promote abortion on demand. The document is a product of a working group tasked with addressing the issues of having a president who claims to be Catholic but supports abortion on demand and flouts other key Catholic teachings. If the document is approved, it will state that Joe Biden and other Catholic public figures who support abortion and other egregious moral evils should not present themselves for Holy Communion. If the document is passed, however, it will have little effect as it's a non-binding document, and Washington, D.C. Cardinal Wilton Gregory is already on record as opposing the refusal of communion to politicians, even if they advocate positions contrary to Catholic teaching. This past Friday, Senator Bill Hagerty announced legislation to combat big tech censorship. The bill, which will be called the 21st Century Free Speech Act, recognizes social media companies and ISP providers as common carriers subject to regulation, and strikes down Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1934. It also amends Section 232 of the same act to guarantee reasonable, non-discriminatory access to online communications platforms, as well as features for the blocking and screening of offensive material at the discretion of the user. While Hagerty's act is a step in the right direction, it does include a passage providing an exemption which allows ISP providers immunity from prosecution under the act, even if they fail to provide high-speed broadband to their customers in every region of the country. In an op-ed published to the Washington Post, Hagerty said, as Justice Clarence Thomas noted in a recent Supreme Court opinion, common carriers such as trains or phone networks, which are essential to everyday goings-on, connecting people and information, have historically been subject to special regulations, including a general requirement to serve all comers without discrimination. The same logic should apply to big tech. Well, this past weekend was a bad one for the Republican Party's most despicable and useless members. On Saturday, Mitt Romney was booed at the Utah GOP convention when he got on stage. Several in attendance also called him a communist and a traitor, and this heckling continued until state GOP chairman Derek Brown called for order. But Romney isn't the only rhino on the boilerplate. Just an hour before Pierre Delecto got booed off stage in Utah, Representative Lance Gooden of Texas tweeted that he believes Liz Cheney would be losing her leadership position in the party by the end of May. In his tweet, he cited Cheney's promise to campaign on impeaching Trump every day of the week. Gooden isn't the only Republican fed up with Cheney, though. Both Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise want to see this traitorous relic go the way of the dinosaurs as well. And their ire, it extends well beyond Cheney's bashing of President Trump to her bashing of other people in party leadership. Cheney seems intent on taking our party back to the failed policies of the Bush-Cheney era, and she drew additional ire after she called Representative Jim Banks a neo-Marxist for his memo to the House Republican leadership, which stated that the Republican Party should focus more on issues that matter to workers, like immigration and trade. Of course, Cheney's leadership position isn't the only thing she's likely to lose. Polling in Wyoming shows Cheney has very little support from Republican voters, and she will likely lose her primary race in 2022 if she chooses to run, which some people are rumored to say she may not choose to run just to save herself the embarrassment. And that has been This Week in the News. And I apologize for the longer duration of this, but that breaking news was important. In any case, I want to reintroduce our guest. He is a long-term friend of mine from Los Angeles. Joey Macasieb has a bachelor's in political science from Loyola University of New Orleans, and I've seen him work before. He's great with numbers, and he is rarely ever wrong, and I don't know whether I can attribute that just to a natural talent or his very conservative estimates. So here is my interview with Joey. We're going to talk the special elections in Texas 6, as well as the Congressional Reapportionment Report that came from the Department of Commerce. And we recorded this interview yesterday evening. Good afternoon, Joey. How are you? By the way, I don't know if anyone's told you, you're not supposed to outdress the host of the show.
Yeah, you when you're doing an appearance like this, and especially what we're going to be talking about today, you always got to try to look your best. I don't want to be sitting here in my California T-shirt and everything. But thank you so much for having me today. It's wonderful to be here, Will.
No problem. For those who missed the introduction, by the way, my friend Joey here, good longtime friend of mine, has a bachelor's in political science from Loyola University of New Orleans. Got that back in 2013?
That's correct. Go
Excellent.
Wolfpack.
Well, let's get straight into our questions then. So, I want to start by talking about the Texas Special Election for District 6. Democrats have talked it up as a competitive district. They cite the fact that Trump won this district by 3 points less in 2020 than he did in 2016. But in Saturday's special election, the only two candidates who passed the threshold to be counted in the runoffs were Republicans. So, how do you interpret these results, especially as how it relates to that district in Texas elections?
Yeah, definitely. So, putting it in context, we're talking about a Dallas-Fort Worth area suburb, Texas 6th Congressional District. The major point to hammer on here is that there were about 11 Republicans on the ballot here. The total number of GOP voters that came out for this was about 61.9%. To the Democrats, 36.8%. So President Trump won this district by 3 points, somewhere in there. That's a 22-point shift in favor of the Republican Party. What is that telling me? Not a whole lot. It tells me that politics is local, which we know. It tells me that it's probably a lot of style over substance. President Trump did struggle in suburbs, even in deep red states like Texas. But what it also tells me is that there's a Republican message out there that's resonating with voters, especially with the kinds of voters the Republican Party needs to win to hold states like Texas. And that's the operative word here, is that we are holding Texas 6. It's going to be filled by Republican again. We need to have net gains to regain control of the House in 2022. That's fine. But it could also tell me something about the candidate herself. I can't remember her first name, but her last name is Wright. Her husband previously held the seat. God rest his soul. He passed away from COVID-19. Could be name recognition. I think that's what we're seeing here. Time's going to tell.
I definitely agree with that. For example, in Baltimore, there actually were calls for the late Elijah Cummings' wife to run for his seat after he died. And it seems like when a spouse runs for their deceased spouse's seats, that they do have that advantage to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. We also saw it in Louisiana. Congressman-elect Luke Letlow passed away from COVID-19 as well. His wife was recently elected to fill his seat. A trend, possibly more so that these are safe Republican districts. More than likely, name recognition. You know your congressman's name. They've been there for a while. For a lot of voters, it's just, why throw the baby out with bathwater? Let's just keep things the way they're going. Obviously, the spouse is a former congressman. Probably going to have the same views.
It's the electoral comfort blanket.
Exactly. A very electoral comfort blanket. It's a great way to put it.
So another interesting result that I took note of was the low turnout for a certain Republican, Michael Wood. He was the only Republican to publicly campaign as anti-Trump. As of early April, he only raised $98,000. To put that into perspective, Baltimore's Republican mayoral candidate last year raised over $100,000. So he couldn't even outperform a Republican candidate in a blue city. And it appears that he had hoped for a bipartisan coalition to get him into the seat, but in the end, he only got 3.2% of the vote. So what does that say about Texas 6, and by extension, the rest of Texas's residents in terms of party loyalty?
I think what it's probably the biggest thing it's telling me is that Michael Wood probably came off as not as ingenuine. He was a little bit of a media darling, came out with this political ad with, the January 6th riot with, tying Trump to that with, but the Democrats were terrible, but I did vote for Trump. in the mind of your typical voter, I think there's a disconnect there. You're coming off as like, yeah, I did this, but lol, JK, that's not what voters want to hear. You seem wishy-washy. You seem flip-floppy. You tie in the media, which is more distrusted than Congress these days. An endorsement from Adam Kinzinger, which now we're talking about an Illinois Republican getting involved in Texas state politics. Texas Spirit doesn't like that. Texas is Texas. Don't mess with Texas. Stay out of Texas politics if you're not from here. Probably had a lot to do with it. It was just the way it was carried. Probably wasn't good. Probably didn't come off the way he needed to with the voters. And no name recognition. That's the other big thing. You can be in front of as many cameras as you want, but at the end of the day, again, we go back to that name recognition, that star power, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, definitely the Kitzinger thing was also a bit of poison. How do you think that's going to reflect on Kitzinger's performance if he
I don't
comes
know how
up
it's
for
going
re-election?
Yeah, I'm not sure, and that's because of redistricting. Adam Kinzinger's district very well may not exist by the time Illinois' districts are redrawn. We don't know. That data is not yet available. As to the rest of the data is not available as to what's needed to draw the lines for those districts. We don't know. It's tough to say. Kinzinger may pull it off again. He may get primaried. It really there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of variables left.
Interesting. That actually makes a great segue because I actually want to turn to the census results because this week the Department of Commerce released the Apportionment Report, and it's raised a lot of eyebrows. I'm going to read out these results real quick for my viewers who may not have read them. So, the following states gained seats. Texas gained 2 House seats, Colorado gained 1, Florida gained 1, Montana gained 1, North Carolina gained 1, and Oregon gained 1. Now, the losses are what raised people's eyebrows, because California, for the first time in history, lost 1 House seat. Along with that, Illinois lost 1 House seat. We just talked about that. Michigan lost 1 House seat. New York lost 1 House seat. Ohio lost 1 House seat. Pennsylvania lost a House seat, and so did Virginia. So it's a shift of 7 seats between districts. So my question is, obviously what most people have noticed is that California lost a House seat. Everyone's flipping out over that. But is there anything else people have overlooked while they're, mostly sitting here buzzing about California's humiliating loss?
Talk about California. California exodus. We have our own state politicians and calling out a myth. Well, when we're looking at the census data, the way it's breaking down to about 713,000 people per district. So California is losing a district. That means there's been an exodus of almost 1 million people from the state of California. What we don't know yet is who is leaving and why. Speculation, gospel according to Joey here. California's economy has been ravaged for years. COVID-19 didn't help. Our shutdowns were ridiculous. Downtown Los Angeles itself, a business center, shuttered businesses everywhere. Restaurants, jewelry stores, bars, some of the tourist attractions that we depend on for our own to stimulate LA's economy. It's not good. What that tells us is it's middle class business owners who are leaving California. It could also be standard blue collar employees. We do have a lot of trades. We have one of the best trade schools in the country here in Los Angeles. It could be that too. It's taxes. It's the kitchen table issues. When mom and dad sit down to make their budget, what are they talking about? How to put food on the table, how to keep kids in school. They have kids in college. California is not helping with its high taxes and its increase in spending. They'll always tout this massive budget surplus that we have. Where's it going? There's a lot left. There's a lot of questions left in there. And the last bit of census data that we're waiting for to come out, which should have been out by now, mind you, is probably going to tell the full story.
And of course, I want to bring this up because I love to speak in rumor and innuendo. I actually heard a rumor that they were holding back on releasing some of this data? Because like you said, this should have been released last December, and I hear that the people at the Department of Commerce were holding back to help the blue states and see if they could fudge the numbers. But it sounds like even with the numbers fudged, they're going to be looking at some humiliating losses.
Yeah, New York fell 89 people short of being able to keep its total number. So,
and we'll be doxing those 89 people at the end of the program. Just kidding. But it's really ridiculous. Now, another thing that I noted from the census data, obviously, was that Texas gained those 2 House seats, which is great for Texas. But most of this population boost we're seeing is rumored to be from people who are doing the California exodus, like you said, that politicians claim didn't exist. So my question is, we all well know that liberals carry their destructive voting habits from the blue states they've destroyed to new states in this destructive, mindless, locust-like swarm. They just don't learn the lesson. So my question is, do you think that a Republican will either pick up these 2 new House seats, or will Democrats take them because the voters are mindlessly voting the same way they did in the state they destroyed?
Well, in Texas, we have the Republican supermajority in the state legislature that's going to be drawing these districts. That is kind of point number one. Number two is what happened in the Rio Grande Valley over 2016 and 2020. And this is probably the biggest story to tell on Texas. The Rio Grande Valley is a predominantly Hispanic area. We're talking border state Texas. We're talking Robert Francis O'Rourke's former district in El Paso. So Hillary Clinton won this area, the Rio Grande Valley here, by about 39 points in 2016. That lead for Joe Biden was cut down to 15 points. That's a 24-point shift toward Republicans in a majority Hispanic area. And we saw the same thing happen in Florida, especially with Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade ousted a Democrat, and in came Maria Salazar to take over that district, by and large because of Hispanic voters. There's a realignment happening. It's going to take a couple more cycles to really call it a true realignment. But with this kind of voter migration away from the Democrats, I really don't see Texas being anything more than fool's gold for the Democrats, at least for the next 10 years, possibly for the next 20. I'd like to see a couple more cycles and hard data on elections before I am willing to make a grand pronouncement about that. But it just doesn't look good for the Democrats in a Republican stronghold like Texas.
But it's encouraging for us.
Yeah, same with Florida. We're not talking about Florida as a purple state anymore. We're talking about Florida as a lightly red leaning Republican state now, and that's by and large due to Ron DeSantis, his Republican majority, former governor, now Senator Rick Scott. A lot of work that was done there.
It's good news in some ways, although you said, we want to be cautious, watch a few elections go by. In a 20-year perspective, though, between 2010 and 2020 censuses, Texas has picked up 6 House seats in the past 20 years, and is still remained a Republican stronghold the whole time, much to the frustration of the Democrats. So do you think that there's a chance Texas will flip blue anytime soon, or do you think that its policies are attracting enough people who love freedom to keep it red?
I'm pretty confident it's Texas's business-friendly environment, it's lower taxes. I really just do not see a scenario within the next 10 to 20 years at this point of Texas flipping blue.
That's good news too. I mean, the Democrats are constantly hoping for this. I mean, you're on Twitter too. There was this one account that was harassing a bunch of Texas Republicans saying, "Oh, we're going to flip the state blue. It's going to be Governor Beto O'Rourke." And of course, I think, going back to the turn of Latino voters to Republicans, I think some of definitely what turned them off in Texas anyway was the Democrat running around, the Irish Catholic Democrat, pretending to be a Latino.
Beto O'Rourke's got bigger problems, including his hell yes, we're coming for your AR-15s. Not a good platform to be running on in Texas.
No.
Hammering the border is really what's going to help Republicans keep these gains. 40% disapprove of Joe Biden's handling of the border crisis right now. That's
after a poll last week that showed 51% disapprove of it. So either way, the man's underwater. He's
And
putting children in cages.
the front lines of this are Texas. It's Texas, it's Arizona, it's New Mexico to a smaller extent, and it's California. It could look good for us in San Diego County too with this the border. It just really depends.
Well, there's definitely some stuff to look forward to. However, that music means it's time for our game segment, which I know you've been looking forward to. It's time for Dictators or Democrats. So, really quickly here. Basically, I've tweaked this game a little bit since the first episode I did this. Instead of just reading the quote, you will also get to ask a couple of questions if you're having a hard time, such as the continental background of the ethnicity of the person who said it. So we're just talking like general region. They could be a U.S. citizen. They could be actually living on this continent now. The decade they said it in, and as well as, their gender, if you must. But you can only pick two of those questions, of course. So we're going to get started here with the quote. Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the wrongdoings of Israel. So, without further ado...
Wasn't that Ilhan Omar?
You guessed it with 4 minutes left to go. That was Ilhan Omar in 2012 on Twitter. You didn't even have to ask the questions.
I remember that one. This
is why we can't play this game with people who have a bachelor's in political science. They remember this shit.
Well, I remember that because it was so blatantly anti-Semitic and ridiculous.
Oh, boy. Well, that game kind of blew up in my face, but still... Let's go for another then, since you got this one so quickly.
Keep them coming.
Okay. So, religion is a psychic disease of the brain. Again, dictator or Democrat.
National origin.
Again, not national, but continental. They origin. Are European in ethnicity.
Dictator Karl Marx.
You actually got this one wrong, Joey. The dictator in question was Benito Mussolini in his 1904 book, which was actually called God Does Not Exist. And God, I needed to end that music because that music was so bad. Yeah. Now, in February 2018, though, just to make a parallel here, this is a leftist ideology. A Democrat could have said this. In February 2018, liberal talk show host Joy Behar actually mocked Vice President Mike Pence's Christian faith as proof he was mentally ill, which, shows that this is, for over 100 years, has been some crackpot idea of the liberals that, oh, you must be mentally ill if you're religious.
Yeah, as though persons who struggle with depression and other things don't often turn to faith to help them through their crises. But we don't need to get into that. That's another story for another time.
It definitely is, but again, you got the first one right away. That's egg on my face. I was hoping to be able to do like one of these per round of that game, but boy, maybe I need to make these harder.
If you went with the ones that weren't just so blatantly outrageous that they stick in your memory, I probably would not have gotten it.
But that's the fun thing, is everything that these dictators or even some of these Democrats say is so blatantly outrageous. And the fun of the game is that they often sound so alike.
Absolutely.
Well, we've got about a minute left here, so if there are any closing thoughts you want to give us on either Ilhan Omar or the elections in general, go ahead.
Yeah, so some of your listeners might be aware that we recently qualified a recall here in California.
That's right.
I'm going to close with this, and it's going to be highly controversial, and RIP or comment section, do not discount Caitlyn Jenner.
Well, yeah,
Do not do it.
No, that's actually a very valid point. Caitlyn Jenner has some of the same qualities Arnold Schwarzenegger had when he ran in a runoff, in that, even though she's a Republican, she's a celebrity.
What I suspect might even happen is that she's going to be given so much free media time, it's going to be a repeat of Donald Trump in 2016 on a California state level. That's pure speculation on my part, but do not discount the phrase Governor Caitlyn Jenner. Don't do it.
I think that unfortunately we might be saying it, but at least it's not Gavin Newsom.
From your lips to God's ears.
Exactly. It was great having you on, Joey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Definitely going to have you on in the future because we're going to have a lot more election stuff to talk about and break down, especially coming into 2022's midterms.
Absolutely. Once that generic ballot data starts showing up, give me a call. I'm always available.
Of course. Good to have you on.
Thank you.
I'm actually quite glad that I recorded that interview yesterday because I do not think I would have been able to actually enjoy myself doing it as much as I did with this hanging over my head. And excuse the system error there from my computer. It's interesting. Today's news actually kind of interacts with the interview. What did the two mean? Well, for one thing, we have a reason to be optimistic. Electorally speaking, people are rejecting the Democratic Party. They're rejecting a lot of the liberal stuff, and they're moving to these red states. At least that's what we can hope. At the very least, it looks like Texas isn't going to flip anytime soon, and they just gained 2 House seats. There's also a rejection in our own party of the old standard same old, same old. The fact that a candidate who is backed by Liz Cheney and Adam Kitzinger did not even break 2%. But at the same time, we're also dealing with the death of our democracy. Literally the death of our democracy. When we have a presidential administration talking about finding ways to circumvent our United States Constitution so that they can legally spy on and persecute their political opponents. Because we know they're not going to use any of this new fancy circumvention to stop riots as long as they're pro-leftist riots. If I were to say anything, I would take this away from today's program. At the least, be cautiously optimistic, but at the most, be very afraid, because there are dark days ahead of us. In any case, I will see you all in 2 weeks. And again, I'm sorry for the very, very dramatic tone of this program. I did not expect ever in my lifetime to hear something like this, and yet here we are. To have them openly and blatantly admit that they are going to try and circumvent our Constitution is bad. But hopefully at least next year, and in the next 10 years, we'll see a trend going towards Republicans. Hopefully we will. We're seeing a lot of blue state exodus. They're going to have a lot less influence in Congress. And hopefully that'll benefit us and the American people. So, as the host of the Weekly Roundup, I'd like to say thank you for viewing and have a great 2 weeks.